Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeanette Mulvey, the editor-in-chief of Co. by U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to our first small business update of 2025. I'm super excited to be here today. We have a lot to talk about, so much going on, so many questions, so many changes, and we have the best person at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to walk us through all of it. Before I introduce him, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Dell, FedEx, Oracle, Square, T-Mobile for Business, and Walmart Business. Thank you to all of you for sponsoring this very important programming that we do. My guest, Neil Bradley, who is Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is here today. Neil, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Jeanette. It's great to see you again. It's still January, so can I say Happy New Year?
Happy New Year to you, but we do have so much to talk about because not only is it a new year, but it's a new administration and things are changing so fast every single day. So I'm glad that you're here early in the year to walk us through it.
Absolutely.
So the last time I interviewed you was in October, and at that time we had no idea how the election was going to play out, who was going to be in the White House, who was going to hold the majority in Congress. Now we know the answers to all of those questions. And so the small business owners I'm talking to are asking, what does the U.S. Chamber of Commerce think are the biggest changes, the biggest issues that this administration will make that will be impacting small business? So I ask you that question.
Yeah, of course. So obviously, we have President Trump now back in office. Very, very slim Republican majorities in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. But that means that Republicans effectively control the elected branches of government, at least for the next 2 years. That means that certain things are going to change. And let's start with some of the ones that may be the most positive for businesses across the country. And that is regulatory uncertainty and regulatory cost. We saw a lot, particularly in the last year and a half or so, kind of new regulatory requirements coming out of the prior administration. By their own count, the regulations imposed costs on the private sector of about $1.8 trillion. That is a historic level of kind of regulatory costs. Many of those regulations are now in the process of being put on hold, of being rewritten, and in some cases actually being removed from the books entirely. That's a process that'll take the better part of a year and a half, but we're going to see a significant rollback in the regulatory burden imposed on businesses. We're going to see more tax certainty, we think, at the end of the day, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but that's going to be good for thinking about the tax obligations and the profitability of your business. There are other areas that may not be so good. For example, I think the new administration is much more inclined, for example, to impose tariffs that could impact imports, including intermediate goods that businesses may be buying either to build new things here in the U.S. or to sell to their customers, and that could have a negative impact. So a lot of good things, some things that we're watching as well.
Of the regulatory rollbacks that you just mentioned, is there anything that jumps out at you that the majority of small businesses might be interested in knowing about? Just some examples of the kind of regulation?
Yeah, so for example, on the labor front, with respect to who you're required to pay overtime to and who's exempt and who's non-exempt. If you happen to be an independent contractor yourself or you happen to use 1099 independent contractors, greater clarity on that so that there's no real liability for the businesses that utilize properly these independent contractors. Access to credit is always an issue for businesses. And so this is an example of regulations that aren't imposed directly on small businesses unless you're a small bank, but the regulations that have been imposed on banks have actually restricted the availability of credit to small businesses. And so rolling back those regulations should mean that it's easier for small businesses to access credit. And so those are things that are just really going to hit the bottom line for a lot of small businesses.
I'm glad you brought up the 1099 employees, the workers thing, because that's a huge issue for so many small businesses. So I think that's one that they'll be looking at. So we talked a little bit about taxes, and I want to dive into that a little bit. You and I have talked about this tax cliff that was coming. And so can you update us, explain again what that really means and where things stand with that?
So it feels like an eternity ago, although I guess it wasn't that long ago. But back in 2017, Congress and President Trump in his first term enacted a pretty major piece of tax reform. It was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and it lowered taxes not only on individuals and families, but it lowered taxes on businesses, both corporations and pass-through entities, the way most small businesses are organized. Many of those provisions sunset. And so some of them have already begun to expire. Things like the R&D credit has lost some of its value. The ability to expense your capital purchases, that's decreased. But a lot of the remaining provisions expire on December 31st, 2025. And so for a lot of businesses, for a lot of individual taxpayers, we'll go back to the tax rates that you were paying before 2017. You add all those parts up, it's about a $4.5 trillion, trillion with a T, automatic tax increase. And so that's why we call it a cliff. It's huge. It would have a devastating impact on the economy if it were allowed to occur. And that's what we're working with Congress and the new president to avoid happening.
Are you hopeful? Do you get the feeling that these taxes cuts will be extended?
I do. I do think at the end of the day they'll be extended. There's going to be probably some drama around it. It's Washington after all, and even when Republicans have unified control as they do now, there's going to be lots of arguments about what's in the bill, what's not in the bill. But importantly for small businesses, I think a lot of the provisions that they've come to rely on are likely to get extended. And so one of the ones we're most focused on is called the 20% deduction or credit, or 199A if you're talking to your accountant and they're using the tax code jargon. That's really important because what that provision says is that if you're a pass-through business, a sole proprietorship, a partnership, an S corp, your top marginal tax rate today is 29.6%. If that expires, you go to 39.6%. And so that's a 10-point jump. To put it in perspective, think of it this way. You have $100,000 in profit for your small business. At 29.6, you pay $29,600 in federal taxes. At 39.6 on that exact same profit, you're paying $39,600. So this is a huge tax increase that would hit basically every small business in America. I'm confident that we're going to get it extended, but we're going to have to do the work to make that happen.
Great, thank you. Let's just talk about the economy more broadly. What are we seeing in terms of what businesses can anticipate this year in terms of growth, inflation, interest rates, and at the end of the day, really access to capital, which is so important to small businesses?
Yeah, so okay, let's start with growth, and let's start with where we just finished in 2024. We had a pretty good year in terms of overall economic growth. We're going to be right around 3%. That's where we want to be because remember, in comparison, for most of the prior decade, we've been at about 2% growth. So we're growing about 50% faster than we were. The outlook for 2025 is that we should be able to replicate that type of growth. Now, listen, one of the reasons that people may have not felt like the economy was growing as fast as it was because of these inflated prices. We had inflation that was at 40-year highs. And while we've been able to bring down the rate of increase in prices, prices are still going up faster than we want. So our target for the Federal Reserve, at the economy, is essentially about a 2% annual increase in prices. Today, we're a little bit closer to 3%. a lot better than 5 or 8 where we've been, but we still have work to do. And I think one of the things that we're watching the closest over the course of the next year is, can we finish the job fighting inflation? Can we bring that down a little bit more? And so it's always the last little bit that's the hardest part. And it's the part in which policy could impact it directly. So I think our biggest challenge economically in 2025 is finishing the fight against inflation. By the way, you're hearing that from the Federal Reserve. In their most recent meeting, kind of what they said is, we're not sure about the path that we're on and whether we're going to finish the job. And therefore, we might not be able to continue to cut interest rates as quickly as we wanted to. And of course, what that means is that while it's a good news for our ability to fight inflation, it means higher interest rates, higher costs of borrowing for small businesses and consumers, and that might lag a little bit longer. That will obviously hurt access to capital for small businesses, but the hope is that the combination of the deregulation, regulatory relief that we talked about a moment ago, will help offset that, and that in net for small businesses, it's going to be a little bit easier this year to access capital, but it's a thing we'll have to keep our eye on because the threat of renewed inflation is real.
Question that I think a lot of small businesses don't understand, and I'm wondering if you have insight into this. Do higher interest rates just make access to capital more expensive for small businesses, or does it also make it actually harder to get a loan? Do you know what I'm asking?
I
Like,
do,
does it make
yeah.
it less likely to be approved?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, your approval for a loan really is driven by your credit worthiness. And so that's a key element at the end of the day. But the way that the adjustment in interest rates work is it makes the cost of capital, the cost of loans, kind of more expensive. And it also means that the interest that you can earn on deposits, on not putting that money out into the form of loans, is higher. And so it tends to be an incentive to reduce lending. And that's the goal, right? Like, inflation is bad, right? And it kind of robs us of our wealth and our purchasing power. And so the remedy for inflation also isn't good. It's just the medicine that it takes. And that medicine is making less credit available. And so it's not just that it makes it more expensive, it does, but it also means that there's just generally less credit in the economy. And that's the way that you try to control and bring down inflation. So it's a messy process. It's why it's so important that policymakers try to avoid inflation in the first place. Because once you get it, no one likes the inflation and no one likes the remedy.
I'm glad I asked you that question because that is exactly the answer that I was looking for. I think a lot of us don't necessarily understand how the interconnectedness of that. So thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. The U.S. Chamber CEO, Suzanne Clark, gave her annual State of American Business talk last week. I know you were also involved in that. And the message was, and always is, that all business is local. And we here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce represent businesses of all sizes. And I wanted to just give you a minute to talk about how we think about the role of small business and local business in the larger business ecosystem.
Yeah, well, you used the word that I was about to go to right there, Jeanette, and that's ecosystem, because it really is an ecosystem. And so think about it this way. If you look at the private sector, so leave out the people who work for government, for example, about half of our fellow Americans work for a small business in the private sector. About half work for a big business. But the interconnectedness that occurs between small and big is really remarkable. And it occurs on the local level. Small businesses are suppliers and vendors to really big businesses. So, you have a local restaurant or that's part of a chain, or let's say that you have a big box store. Listen, when the plumbing goes bad, when the AC or the heat, we're in January, when the heat goes out, you're likely calling a small local company that's helping you fix that. When you're a big business, your customers are often those small businesses. And so you really can't separate out this ecosystem. And what Suzanne and what the team heard at the State of American Business from both really big employers and some small businesses was this independent recognition that we all need each other, that we need the innovation, the entrepreneurship, the flexibility that really shines in America's small businesses. But we also need the scale and the ability to reach national and global customer bases that America's large businesses create. And so it's an ecosystem that at the Chamber we're proud to represent.
Immigration is a fraught issue right now, but to our previous question, it impacts businesses both big and small. Can you talk a little bit about immigration more specifically in terms of what the key issues are right now that are impacting business and how you anticipate them being worked out?
Yeah. So when people hear immigration, it tends to be their first thought right now is the border. And we absolutely have a crisis at our border. You can't have people kind of coming into your country illegally. You need orderly processes here. We're a nation of immigrants, of course, but we need processes for bringing immigrants in and integrating them into our society. And so a lot of the attention right now is on those efforts around securing the border. But for business and for the national economy, there's also a larger issue at play here, and that is the overall size of our labor force and our ability to grow. You know, if you go back kind of pre-pandemic, the norm in the United States was that at any given moment in time, we had more people who were looking for work than we had open jobs. Right before the pandemic hit, and I remember you and I were talking about the labor shortage then, something had flipped in the script. We had more open jobs than we had people looking for work, and businesses, particularly small businesses, were having a hard time filling those jobs. That got a little bit disrupted by the pandemic, but for the past several years, and including today, we've stayed in that pattern. More open jobs than people looking for work. And as the folks joining us today know, your ability to expand your business, your ability to meet consumer demand today is constrained by your lack of workers. And so where this gets interconnected is we do need more people with legal work authorizations to be able to work in the United States. And so that means increasing legal immigration. It means for those people who've been here a while in some form of legal status, you can think about dreamers or people with so-called temporary protected status, some of whom have been here for 20 years. I was talking to a guy who he's on that status. He owns a construction company. Like, he is helping rebuild housing destroyed in natural disasters. We need more of those type of people. And so that's where this intersection is going to come into play. You know, interestingly, we increasingly hear both from the new administration, from President Trump, and from people on Capitol Hill, that they understand the labor shortages that businesses are facing and that we're going to have to do something to address that.
You sort of answered my next question, which was, do you feel like that is being heard and understood, that this labor shortage is a big problem?
I think it is, but let me just say, I think we can be talking about it more because it is a hard thing to fix. And so remember, a lot of this is driven by demographics. You know, we're in this moment of peak baby boomer retirement. And so it used to be that we were at 10,000 baby boomers a day, kind of reaching retirement age. We're now a little bit above that. And so the generations that are coming along behind just aren't quite as big. And so that puts two types of pressure on the economy. One is the baby boomers who are retired aren't in the labor force working anymore. But thankfully, they're still around. They're with us and they're still consuming and they want to go out to dinner and they want to go on vacation and they're buying things for their homes and they're still consuming in the economy. And so we need more people to help produce the things that they want to consume.
We talked a little bit before about tariffs. I'd like to go back to that. First of all, can you just really simply explain the difference between a tariff and a tax, if there is one? And then just for people, I've gotten emails from people in our Co 100 who have said, we are importing products from Canada or from wherever, and we're really worried. So just what can you say to these people to at least tell them where we think things are going to land and when?
Yeah. So a tariff is a tax. It's just collected a little differently. We tend to think about taxes as something that we write a check every quarter to the IRS and to our State Department of Revenue, kind of based on our income. And so our income minus our expenses, and we have profit or wages, and we pay a tax on that. A tariff is kind of like a sales tax. So we experience sales taxes. We buy something, and at the register, we pay a sales tax on top of the price of it. A tariff works the same way. You have a widget, for example, that comes into the United States from another country, and the person who brings in that widget has to pay a tax on it before they do anything with it. And so widget comes in, it comes in on a truck or a ship or on an airplane. It gets processed that this widget came into the United States. You now owe the federal government X amount for this widget. And so it's a tax, it's just collected a little differently. Of course, like all taxes, it means prices go up. So when I go to a store and I buy something, the total money out of my pocket is the cost of the good plus the sales tax. If you're importing something, either for resale or to use in your own business, the cost is the good now plus the tariff that you've paid. So it raises prices. We've had increases in tariffs over the last several years, particularly on products from China. But President Trump has now been talking about expanding those, not just the tariffs that are on China, but tariffs on products from Canada and Mexico, our two biggest trading partners, as well as the potential for global tariffs, tariffs on all products from all countries across the world. And so it remains to be seen whether he's going to pursue those type of tariffs or not. On his first day in office, he issued an executive order that told some of his agency officials to go out and look into these tariffs and to report back to him by April 30th with their recommendations on what to do. Now, since then, he's talked about maybe he would implement tariffs, particularly on Canada and Mexico before then, but it remains to be seen. And so this is a space where my best advice for small businesses is pay close attention. It could change very quickly, and when it does, the imposition of tariffs could happen very quickly on things that you're importing, and you probably ought to be thinking about your plan. What happens then? Can you still afford the product? Can you pass along the costs? Can you source the product from somewhere else? Those are the things to be thinking about if you're worried about tariffs.
Let's talk about growth, which is something that I think on Co, sometimes we forget to talk about growth because we're always so excited about people starting businesses. And yet we have so many millions and millions of businesses, legacy businesses that have been around or 20 or 30 years, but they need to be growing. And all of what you and I just talked about is really about helping businesses grow. So are you seeing, first of all, any particular sectors where you're seeing a lot of growth?
Yeah, growth may be my favorite word. Growth is the thing that allows us to do new and innovative things, and it solves problems. And so everything is easier with growth, even though sometimes growth is hard. In terms of the economy and where we're seeing it, it's pretty broad based. So if you look at businesses that have been started in recent years that are adding new employees, which is a good sign of growth, right? More demand, more profitability, ability to add new employees. About 70% of all sectors in the economy are seeing faster growth today than what we saw before the pandemic. Some of the ones that have been a little bit slower include agriculture and mining, for example. They tend to be relatively smaller parts of the overall economy. Where we're seeing some of the fastest growth, retail. People are opening up and expanding new outlets and places to buy things, both brick and mortar and online. We're seeing expansions in healthcare and social services. One of the things that all those baby boomers who are retiring consume is more healthcare, and so we're seeing expansion there. We're also seeing it in hospitality and restaurants and food service. So we haven't stopped kind of wanting to eat out and experience things since the pandemic, and those sectors are growing. And one that's growing about 1.25 times faster than before the pandemic, kind of rounding out the top 5, is construction. And that's really good because that means we're building things for the future. So those are the sectors that where we're seeing the most growth today.
My next question to you is sort of like what needs to happen to foster more business growth, and I think we've covered a lot of that today. Obviously lower taxes, access to credit, decreased regulations, all of those things foster growth. But have we left anything out that you think could really be a game changer in creating opportunities for either growth of existing businesses or new businesses?
Yeah, productivity, and by that, artificial intelligence is at the top of the list. And so, we talked about the workforce challenges, for example. One of the ways to help do more, even when you can't get more people, is to become more efficient. And so technology is what helps us become more efficient. And the breakthrough of today is artificial intelligence. And it's kind of like the breakthrough in the 80s of the personal computer. And you think about just how much more efficient businesses got because we had computers. And then the breakthrough of the internet in the 1990s and our ability to do things like this virtually and our ability to reach consumers around the world beyond our physical footprint. Well, this next efficiency gain, I think, is going to come from artificial intelligence.
So many things that we just talked about in this whole interview, people are using AI for. I mean, resilience, the skills gap, they can do other tasks with AI so that the employees they do have can do other things. So we are seeing people using AI for all sorts of things, but there's also kind of this rumbling all the time about regulations around AI. And I don't actually even know exactly what that would mean, but do you have a sense of like what the regulatory landscape looks like in terms of AI and what might be coming in terms of some kind of regulations?
Yeah, so to put a finer point on your idea of use of it, one of the things we've done at the U.S. Chamber is we surveyed small businesses. And here's what they told us. We surveyed them in 23 and in 2024. In 24, 40% of small businesses told us that they were directly using some type of generative AI product, one of those kind of chat bots that you can use online, or one of the creative design features like design me a logo, create me a menu. That's up from 23% in 2023, so rapid growth. If you add in our small businesses using services that are provided by other big firms that utilize or rely on AI, 98%. So if you're using a management system to manage your customer database, to do your targeted advertising, the services that you are using use AI in the background. And so virtually every small business in America today is using AI. Here's the regulatory threat. And we've already seen it popping up in states. Colorado adopted a law. Texas is in the middle of debating a potential law. And it's really driven by kind of fear, like that we don't know where this technology is going to go. People aren't certain about what it's going to mean for businesses or employment or the customer experience. And so we want government to regulate it. One of the things that has concerned at least me the most in watching it is these regulatory proposals that say, well, I should be able to opt out of AI provided services. So if I'm getting a quote from a company that wants to sell me a service, I ought to have the right to say, I would like you to calculate the cost of this good, but you can't use AI. And so imagine every business in America having to maintain two systems, the old outdated system and then the new AI generated system. That will never work. And some of the proposals that we've seen even get all the way down to tracking customer orders. So we talked to a coffee shop, we talked to a dry cleaner. Like if you're a dry cleaner, one of the things you're trying to manage is how much stuff is coming in, how do you know it, where is that product, how do I get it back to the customer, when do I owe it to them, when do I need to bring in more employees to meet that workload so I can get the dry cleaning to the customer on time. That's AI. And if all of a sudden I get to walk into my dry cleaner and say, no, 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 you can't use that, well, then we've really blown up the whole system. And so there's a lot of misguided ideas out there, particularly at the state level, that I think could be really harmful.
It's hard to imagine another technology where it's been regulated whether you were allowed to use it or not to be a more efficient business. So it's just an interesting time. We've covered a lot of topics. So I just want to give you the opportunity before we wrap it up to tell us how are you just feeling about the small business landscape? I know you personally have a soft spot for small businesses, and it's so important to us at the Chamber, but just kind of how are you feeling generally about the landscape for small business this year?
If I had to pick a word, I think my mood is awe or amazement. Like what we're seeing small businesses do is just really remarkable. We just talked about the AI adoption. I love going and telling policymakers in Washington, D.C., you think of AI as all these big companies, the tech companies that people see on the news. No, 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 no. The reality is millions of small businesses who are just getting super creative and super innovative. I am amazed by the number of small businesses that are just newly opening or growing that we talked about. And the thing is that if you watch too much cable news, or depending on where you get your news, sometimes you can get kind of depressed about the state of world affairs. You go talk to a small business, and if you're depressed or you're pessimistic about the future, you're not opening a new small business. You're not expanding or growing. You're not going out figuring out how to use these new technologies to make your business better. And so I'm in awe of this optimism and this vibrancy that's existing in the small business community.
That's great. And I think that's a great place to leave it. So I want to say thank you so much, Neil Bradley, for joining us.
Thank you, Jeanette. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
Yes, I'll be probably coming back and asking you for another interview probably around May for Small Business Week. So thank you. Thank you to our audience. And again, thank you to our sponsors. We'll be making an announcement soon about a new event series coming from Co for 2025. But until then, please go to growwithco.com for all of our weekly content, news, features, and everything you need to know to run your business. Thank you so much.